Good morning to everybody. My name is Howard Thomas. I'm Dean of the Fellows of the British Academy of Management, and I'm chairing this session on behalf of the four speakers whose bios, somewhat detailed, you can see on the first slide. I'm sure we can get you copies of the slide afterwards, but we have a panel which includes Sue Winnecombe, who's a professor at Cranfield, who's a well-known expert on women in leadership. We have also Professor Nelorine Cornelius, who is from Queen Mary College, London, and is an expert on organisation studies, but very much so on social justice and EDI issues. We then have myself, who's been known in the field as a serial dean, in that I've been a dean multiple times on various continents, and therefore I'm giving my perspective on this issue, this important issue of taking roles seriously. And similarly, I'm followed by Nick Beach, who's president of the British Academy of Management, and is also going to talk on this issue from a university perspective, but also from the perspective of having co-authored the BAM CMI piece on EDI, which Nelorine is going to talk about, and probably Nick will expand a little bit on that study. So we're now going to pass on to Professor Sue Winnecombe from Cranfield University.
I'm very excited to kick off this morning's session because I think this is a really important topic for us at business schools and universities to engage with. So I want to start this conversation by looking at what the leading companies in the UK are actually doing about race and ethnicity. And here I would like to just acknowledge the great help and support from my colleague Doyin Atawalagon, who has really kind of led the work on race and ethnicity. I have worked with her at Cranfield, whereas as Howard has just explained to you, I'm really the lead on the gender work. So can we have the next slide, please? So I just want to contextualize the work that I've been involved with in the Parker Review, which is really looking at the lack of Black and ethnic minorities directors on our top boards. Now, this work on Parker really began in 2016. So just to give you the background, I was invited on and working on the Lord Davis Review on the lack of women on our top boards in 2010, and that took place from 2010 to 2015. And during that time, we doubled the percentage of women on the FTSE 100 boards from 12.5% to 25%. But towards the end of that period, what we noticed is that the boards were being filled primarily by non-executive women and by white women, and that clearly the whole issue of Black and ethnic minorities was emerging as being very significant. So on account of that, Sir Vince Cable asked Sir John Parker, who was part of the Lord Davis Review with me, whether he would head up a special review to look at the lack of race and people of different races and Black and ethnic minorities on our top board. So the Parker Review came into existence in 2016. There was a report published in 2017 and another report earlier this year, rather, in 2020. So I just want to really highlight the findings from that. I want to start by saying that when we got together on the Parker Review, the first issue that really faced us was terminology, and I think continues to be very problematic. As many of you know, in the UK, we tend to commonly refer to Black and ethnic minority BAME people. Actually, in the US, we refer to people of colour, and that was the terminology that we picked up in the Parker Review. But this continues to be a big issue, and a number of you may have read Sharon White's comments about using this term and others, because in using such a broad term of Black and ethnic minority or people of colour, we are really masking major differences, and primarily the lack of Black people on the top of boards. So I know in my own university, when I've spoken to our Vice Chancellor, he says to me, "Oh, Sue, we're doing really well on Black and ethnic minority professors." But actually, if you unpack it, we do have a number of Asian male professors, but we have very few Black members of faculty, and certainly none at professorial level. The other major issue we confronted on Parker, and that continues to be an issue as we go forward with this, is the whole issue of data collection. Because with gender, all companies collect data on gender, but data on race and ethnicity is. So out of the Parker Review, Parker published its first review at the beginning of 2017. And as a group, what we decided on was that it was really important that every FTSE 100 company had at least one director who was a Black ethnic minority or a person of colour by the end of 2021. And assuming that the FTSE 250, slightly smaller boards, are rather behind FTSE 100, that they would meet this target by 2024. Could I have the next slide, please? Just very quickly, I want to share with you what the top headlines are, because I think they're, really rather depressing. In 2016, under Doyen Atawolagun's leadership, we conducted a very robust study of looking at who the directors of colour were on the FTSE 100 boards at that time. And it's just to say, as you can see in front of you, the majority of the boards, 53%, were all white boards. And in fact, there were only 92 seats held by them. And actually, if you look deeper into it, there actually was a concentration of 7 companies that actually had nearly around 40% of those directors. In 2020, and I should caveat this was not such a robust measurement point. It was done by self-report, but we can see that amongst the FTSE 100 boards, actually the number of all-white boards has reduced considerably from 53% to around about a third, 37%, but very little increase in the number of seats. Across the whole FTSE 350, because the government did look across the whole set, in fact, only 8 companies accounted for 25%, and only 106 of those 350 companies at that time, earlier this year, had met the Parker target of one person of colour or Black and ethnic minority on their board. Next slide, please. Now, on the back of all our work that we have done on gender, what we realised is, and I'm sure you've all heard the phrase many times, that what gets measured gets done. So we actually we did a separate report at Cranfield University on looking at how FTSE 350 companies report on ethnic diversity in their reports. And I just want to really highlight 2 quick findings, because again, I think they're rather depressing findings. Only 33% of those top 100 companies even mention ethnic diversity in their board diversity policy. And just as a comparative point for you, 83% mention gender. So ethnicity is very far behind where we are with gender. And only 4 companies had measurable objectives for ethnic diversity. Now, I think that's such a terrible finding that I'm going to repeat it, that only 4 of our top 100 companies actually have objectives that they can measure for ethnic diversity. So next slide, please. So just in summarising where we are with Parker, we still have a long way to go in just meeting what I think is a minimum requirement of having just one person of colour or Black or ethnic minority on your top board. So the 4 recommendations that have come out of Parker so far is just the real importance of our companies reporting on ethnicity and race, not just nationality. I don't know how many of you realise, but all listed companies in the UK have to have an external board review every 3 years. And what we were recommending is that when board consultants look into the performance of boards, that they comment on diversity in its full sense, not just gender, but also ethnicity. That the focus on ethnic diversity should happen not just at board level, but also in the pipeline. So this was one of the things that we have learned from our work on gender. In the Davis Review, what we found is we did focus on the board, but actually it was really important to make sure that we are actually promoting women, and in this case, Black and ethnic minority people, into the executive pipeline. And lastly, I just want to make this point that, and this is still a common occurrence in companies, that meritocracy gets very, very confused with diversity. People are very concerned that if you set any kinds of diversity targets, that actually you're compromising meritocracy. And I think, it's really important to understand that in reality, our organizations are not meritocratic. I mean, actually, if we look at the stark figures at the entry levels, probably around 38% are white men. And isn't it interesting that at kind of, top executive level, 70% are white men. So how come they do so superbly well in being developed and promoted, and the rest of us, women and Black and ethnic minority people, get left behind? So very important to look at this whole piece on meritocracy and diversity. And last slide, please. I just want to finish on a comment which was made by Sir John Parker, which I think is very important and does sum up this area, that, however difficult it was with gender, actually the challenges facing us with race and ethnicity are much greater. And as John says here, even more than with gender, for every chairman or CEO reading his report, this feels like dangerous territory. Now, I'm going to stop there. I'm then going to pause just in case there are any quick points of clarification before passing on to Nellarine, who's really going to pick up this work with FTSE companies, because BAM actually did some very interesting work on this a couple of years ago, and then to progress this conversation on to looking at what we can do in the business school. So let me just stop for a moment and see if there are any quick points of clarification. So I see I do have one comment about, do companies have to report on board diversity in their annual reports? The Financial Reporting Council have changed the requirements on what is required, and they have made I think much more detailed requirements on gender. They have got minimal requirements on race and ethnicity. The trouble is, these are just recommendations from the Financial Reporting Council. Unless we actually monitor them, you don't know whether they're actually happening. And as you can see from what I've just said just now, actually there's very minimal reporting on race and ethnicity. I don't think I've got any other comments of clarification here. So I will pass over to you, Nellarine.
We have decided that I'll speak a little bit about that project, but this has been a very strange year and a challenging year in terms of the race and work and race agenda more broadly. So I'll be looking at issues which speak to that report, but are also ongoing challenges that in particular all organizations, but in particular universities face. So if I could have the next slide, please. So it was decided that the British Academy of Management, the Chartered Management Institute, would undertake a project where there'd be an investigation of race in FTSE 100 companies. So along with colleagues at St Andrews, Cardiff, and Queen Mary, and informed by an advisory board from Capita, General Electric, Renewables, Virgin Money, Google and Barclays, we decided that we needed to have a number of work streams. And what we did was to look at lived experience, which we accessed through interviews, online FTSE company accounts of race and in their organizations. So we were very interested in how ethnicity and race were accounted for, if you like, in those organizations, as well as their EDI policies and practice. We did a survey. We were interested in whether race was monitored or not, and we undertook a number of case studies. Now, we launched the report in 2017, and there's a short video that's available that highlights the main findings. So if I may ask for that video to be uploaded, and then I'll proceed once the video is completed. Right. So, as you can see, the findings very much echo the position that Sue highlighted, which is that race is clearly not front and center of any of the agendas, any of the diversity agendas in many of these companies. And what perhaps wasn't conveyed as strongly in the video, but it's something that we observed, very much echoes what Sue identified, which was diversity was taken to be axiomatic with gender diversity, rather than diversity in its true and meaningful sense, which is in terms of the protected categories, including race and particularly race. We have to remember that many of these companies, FTSE companies, have their headquarters in London, and being at Queen Mary, we're very aware that many of the young people in the immediate vicinity are from Black and Asian and minority ethnic groups. So for such a poor account of race in these companies, it was a very, very disappointing story. So the kind of headline recommendations were clearly to start talking about the issue of race. One of the things that came through very strongly in the stories, in the case studies, in the lived experience, was that it was seen as almost a taboo subject, one that people found very sensitive and one that people found very difficult to articulate for fear of falling into the category of being seen as a racist. But also, I think there was an issue of exercising a certain level of privilege. So, as Sue highlighted from the Parker Review, that white men progress very effectively through organizations and women are improving, that there's still work to be done. So there's a kind of position of privilege that people occupy, which maybe becomes more visible and marked through more accounts around race and ethnicity. But the things that we found very disappointing indeed was the failure to measure, to have any kind of evidence base to justify the actions that were taken in and around race. And I think in many ways that's the single most important step that needs to be pursued. If you're going to claim that you're making progress in what way and against what benchmark? And the benchmark essentially has to be that of really accounting for how many people of color are in the organization, at what level, and what kind of progress are they making. So the issue of the pipeline is always really mission critical. You have a lot of people coming in to organizations who are BAME, but they're not making the progress that their qualifications and their skill sets should be enabling them to do. Now, if I could have the next slide, please. Now, COVID-19, of course, has been a huge story this year for all sorts of reasons. This is the reason that we are delivering this this conference online, because of the impact of COVID. What is perhaps not as often articulated is the terrible toll that COVID has particularly exerted on people of colour. So Public Health England and BMA have identified that 90% of all the doctors who have died from COVID-19 are BAME. That's a horrifying statistic. 8 out of 10 women who are pregnant and present with COVID are Black. So we know that there are issues relating to COVID, which might be highlighting other things. It may not be just genetics, it may be circumstances being pushed into the front line. I know certainly there are stories which have been corroborated in care homes where Black staff have been asked to deal with COVID patients and indeed wash dead bodies. So we know that people may just be in situations where they're more vulnerable. But the other big story which relates to race really focuses on the killing of George Floyd in the US. It was a devastating moment, and there were many organizations who felt duty bound to respond to that. Certainly, universities were among those who made comments about their position on race and diversity and the importance of it. What was interesting is the negativity there was towards that. And I really got a hint of that when I got a call from, of all people, Vogue Business, Vogue, the fashion magazine, because the fashion industry had been castigated for making these statements about race when, as an industry, it was clearly incredibly white. So what followed on from that were a number of public debates, and what you see to the right of the PowerPoint slide is a debate between Mary Beard and David Olusoja, both professors at Oxford and Manchester respectively, on the issue of history and memory. And what was really interesting about this debate was the fact that one of the difficulties about talking about race is the really negative and toxic nature of the history in relation to race. If you think of the transatlantic slave trade and the involvement of many of the countries of the global north in the colonization or the enslavement of peoples in the global south. So it's a very important element, I think, particularly for those who are in universities, to try and reconnect with why the Black experience and the experience of people of colour is so difficult to articulate in all sorts of ways. If we think of, for example, business schools, we're at the British Academy of Management Conference after all, there's very little talked about the slave trade, the East India Company. The East India Company was essentially the model for the modern corporation, yet it's not something that's taught. Next slide, please. So if we look at a number of institutions, Bank of England, London Stock Exchange, the picture at the bottom is a stone that was laid at the West India dock, where goods from the Americas were housed safely. You can see that the good and the great were clearly involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And not only were they involved in it, but the monies from that were absolutely vital to the spark of the Industrial Revolution, to the spark of the growth of capitalism, and so on. But we know that it's quite difficult and it has been difficult for all sorts of organizations to really make clear their connections to this. And I wonder if this is part of the difficulty that people have about talking about race and talking about the consequences and the legacies of race. Next slide, please. So what we can see here are a number of universities who have decided that they need to redouble their efforts to try and identify what their connections were to the negativities of colonialism and the slave trade. So we know that there are issues relating to Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes, and the Rhodes Scholars and Rhodes College, and whether Rhodes statue should remain or not. There's a whole issue around statues. Cass Business School is thinking about changing its name because John Cass, was a slave trader. So we know that there are increasing anxieties about associations with slavery, and they're not always obvious. But the worry is that it's seen as tokenistic, that the connection to slavery is much deeper. So we know that the Imperial College was essentially the college that analysed the minerals sent from the colonies, the British colonies, to see if they were what they claimed to be: gold, precious jewels, and so on. And so Imperial College is talking about changing its logo. But actually, although these things are symbolically important, the reality is that the issues of slavery and colonialism certainly resonate in the academy today. But what actions are taken to really ensure that people are faring well, people of colour are faring well? Because in many ways, that is the most important indication of reparations. Those are true reparations. Next slide, please. So there's a kind of liminal attention paid to what is essentially root and branch race equality. So we know that students, their progression rates, if they're BAME, are often not as good. The grades are not as good. Graduate employment is not as good. The curriculum doesn't really reflect world history. It reflects a very narrow Anglophone history, typically, if we're focusing on business schools. And of course, commerce, global commerce, was very much tied into these historical moments. We know that academic staff, Black academic staff, are in more precarious work. Their progression rates are not as good. Their limited representation in senior positions. I'm the only Black professor in my school. The same will be true for professional services staff, with an accumulation of staff at the bottom of the pyramid. And EDA and HRM policies and practices are poor. EDI is at the margins. Universities often see themselves as there for the public good, but EDI is very rarely deeply front and center of line policies and practices, let alone professional HR policies and practices. Next slide, please. So if I'm being brutally honest, I think that much of what is put under the banner of race equality in universities is largely tokenistic. And if we focus on staff in particular, this is the sort of thing that happens quite commonly. Having a person of colour on the selection panel, long listing of people of colour as evidence of fairness, cynical recruitment to boost numbers of people of colour, EDI leads in organisations with no real influence or authority, HRM in the selection panel, so fairness is assured, exclusion from elite areas, engagement rather than real action for change. A lot of this stuff is window dressing. Very often the one example of Black achievement that is used as an indication of post-racial organization. So, Barack Obama becoming president of the United States was supposed to signal a new era. We're in that new era, and it doesn't feel very people of color friendly. Best practice versus evidence-based practice. And what I find really frustrating is a kind of intellectual engagement with the rightness of EDI rather than a practice which is sophisticated and professional. It's often naive. Next slide, please. So I think the thing that really now matters is that each person who is in a position of authority needs to determine what they're going to do to actually make things happen. So one of the things that David Olusoja mentioned in his talk, which I thought was really important, was that we can talk about race equality, we can be upset by the use of insensitive language, but action is actually what matters. What are you going to do to change the status quo, the static frames that we're currently in? So I would encourage all universities to sign up to the Race at Work Charter. It's a very low level of entry, but you've got to start somewhere. It would require universities to capture and publish ethnicity and pay gap data and to take a Race at Work survey on a regular basis. It's an easy start and it's an easy win. I will go back to the work that I've done using the capabilities approach, because I think there's a need to use a different philosophical frame to really capture what's going on. And I think this approach for me does it. The next thing I will do is to go back to Queen Mary, and I decided that I will be on the strategic EDI committee, because I think now, having said it's not my job, it's a moment at which I think things can happen and things can be changed. And finally, I actually have the role of Vice President of the CIPD, and I will ensure that after 15 years of neglect, the EDI will have to be placed at the centre of professional development. So the store that's put in HRM delivering on EDI is a false one. There's been no adequate training for 15 years. So this is what I think senior academics need to do. Find your place, which will enable you to address this agenda, because it's not going to be an easy job for a few people to do. The work has to be, the load has to be spread, and you've got to decide which bit of the load you wish to take up. Thank you very much indeed. That's it from me for the moment. So I'm going to hand straight over to Nick, if that's okay.
I'm not Nick, I'm Howard. I'm the one with more hair. Despite my age. I'm going to try and reinforce quite strongly at the end of my talk exactly what Nelorine was talking about. I think it's time not to to talk, but to try and take positive steps. So at the end of my talk, I'm going to talk about what I think are some of those positive steps. And my talk goes around these 4 issues that you see in the slide. I'm not going to read the slides because I feel that it would be better if I just talk through the issues that are on that slide, and you'll see how they come out. I have to say that I have worked as a business school dean, a serial dean in Europe, in the United States, and in Asia, and I'm pretty heavily involved in business schools in Africa. So I think I have a perspective that is both global and UK oriented. Like Nelorine, I feel that recent events such as the global financial crisis, COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter have increased our awareness of insecurity, inequality, and exclusion from global and technological advances. In particular, in my view, ethnic and racial minorities are the victims of social and racial injustice and suffer substantial disparities and opportunities, often leading to economic and social despair. Nelorine gave 1 or 2 examples already in her talk, and I endorse what she said. Up to us now to identify the appropriate changes that need to take place in management education. My focus here, and some of my work in recent years, and indeed a book on this subject, has been on inclusive growth. What I want to focus on here is inclusive growth in education. My belief is that everyone deserves access to education and the opportunity for a better life. And so for me, inclusion, access is the key. I took the words of a Black university president, who happens to be the president of a university in Florida. And his direct quote is, "Our challenges must be to address talent and character, and actually, interestingly, now in color of skin." I changed that to diversity because of the very language issue that you and Sue were talking about before. And he concludes by saying, talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And I think that's the key question. One of the key elements in our field is that we must make access to and affordability of management education a real issue. Tuition fees in the UK are very high. They're even higher in the United States, private universities. And consequently, it's often difficult and sometimes impossible for racial and ethnic minorities to get the same opportunity as others can get. So let me just start off by giving 1 or 2 stories about my experience in business schools, and then getting back to my point about that change is important. When I examine the record of business schools globally, we have failed. And as I've said to you before, I've been the dean for half of my academic career. We have a dismal record, in my opinion. And the key problem for me with systemic racism is that many decisions taken in business schools, and Nelorine alludes to them in one of her slides, but I take the example of faculty hiring and student admission, and are subject to a different number of influences. Some of them are cultural. For example, according to evidence from the Runnymede Trust, media coverage of race and minorities may influence racism. When that question was posed, 80% of the people said that they thought that was the case. And furthermore, the literature from behavioral decision-making suggests that conscious or unconscious biases exist, such as the well-known stereotyping and profiling of racial categories, where judgments are made about people based upon group categorizations. Further, I think that blind spots and willful blindness about others may also influence decision-making judgments. and attitudes. However, just to balance it a little bit before I get to my end point, there are some good practices amongst this dismal record. And I would point to one which is one in the United States, the PhD project that has been run since 1994 by AACSB International, sponsored by the KPMG Foundation, GMAC, and a number of American business organizations, including Merck and Johnson & Johnson. It has had 25 years of experience in funding and mentoring African Americans, Latin Hispanic Americans, and Native Americans to gain business school PhDs and become professors. Up until the end of 2019, which is roughly 25 years, 1,500 minority professors who graduated from the program are now working in over 530 US business schools as professors, administrators, or leaders. Some of them, such as Professor Ian Williamson, who is a graduate of that program from the University of North Carolina, has recently become the dean at the University of California at Irvine. And another of the graduates, Professor Miles Davis, has become a university president in the United States. Yet, unfortunately, despite this initiative, just 4% of US business school professors are in those categories that I mentioned before. So would the foundations and AACSB and others have said they must go on and make sure that they continue to work with even greater urgency. It's important to note as a counterpoint, however, that according to the current dean of Harvard Business School, which is clearly an elite school, it is only accepted, and these are his statistics, an average of 5% Black students in each of its classes over the last 30 years. Only 4 Black professors have ever been tenured at Harvard Business School. And further, 3 of the 300 or so cases listed as materials in Harvard Business School's capstone leadership course, around 1% have Black minority leaders as role models. Another positive example I give you from my experience in the United States, where I was dean at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign's business school. We targeted a strong scholarship program funded by the university and endowment resources to gain 10% of our undergraduate class to come from minority schools, particularly in Chicago. And we succeeded in doing it. We also had in the university Black administrators who could be identified in greater numbers than the numbers Nellarine talks about in Queen Mary College. We had Black university senators and Black university leaders in the university as a whole, including strong alumni and strong role models. Similar efforts, I would like to say, have been made in the other land-grant US state universities, particularly those in urban areas. The other experience I draw on very briefly is my recent experience in Singapore Management University, where for our undergraduate program, we worked with foundations, government grants, donations to establish a program which we call Project Access, which guarantees on a permanent basis that any qualified student needing support would have free tuition and a maintenance grant for their entire program. And we further established a grant system for those very same students to enable them to study abroad for a semester outside of their home territory. So let me get back to Nellarine and Sue, who talked, I think, very eloquently from a British viewpoint about diversity, ethnic minorities, language. From my perspective, and I've tried to get the data as well as I could, there are very few BAME Business School deans, relatively few BAME tenured faculty. And from the viewpoint of the Fellows College, of which I'm currently dean, Only 3% of the fellows are from BAME constituencies, which is extremely disappointing. But to be fair to the Fellows College, over the last several years, they have made great strides in increasing the gender diversity, but we need now to urgently look at the ethnic, racial, and minority characteristics of that fellowship. So in summary, there are a few good initiatives that have taken place, a few of which I've mentioned, but they are generally sparse. And in my view, lip service has been paid to the inclusion of racial and ethnic minorities in academia. So what do we do now? What do we learn from other countries? And in my view, now is the time to make real change happen. The fundamental principle for me is systemic. We must break down the barriers to opportunities through meaningful and sustainable policies, which, borrowing the words of Nellering, must not be simply tokenism. Therefore, in our universities, we must make business school leadership reflective of the student population. We must make the pathways and progress for promotion of those in business schools clear and fair for everyone, and make it easier for students, particularly minority students and racial minorities and ethnic minorities, to get access high quality management education. So the issue for me here is, it is perhaps important to examine and question government policies regarding access. Should tuition fees be abolished and means-tested maintenance grants be re-established? Borrowing from overseas targeted BAME programs, such as the US's PhD project, should be enacted in the UK. And the mentoring and selection of these candidates must be done by committed senior professors and university administrators, so actually it achieves its goals. We should consider making approaches also to government and foundations to generate a significant number of annual fellowships to enable BAME executives who are working in management positions to transition to academic life, using the historical models that Warwick University did when generating fellowships as it grew, or the Foundation for Management Education Fellowships, which did a similar job in management education as management education grew in Britain. And lastly, from the BAME Fellows College perspective, we need urgently to increase the number of racial, ethnic, and minority fellows in the BAM Fellowship Organization. And as an organization, and I'm sure Nick would reinforce this, BAM has also reinforced its commitment to equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And without taking his thunder, in case he is going to use this remark later on, we have appointed, and BAM under Nick's presidency has appointed a new vice president for EDI, Professor Martina Sliwa from Essex Business School, whose mandate is to champion all elements of EDI and encourage adoption across the whole portfolio of BAM activities. So, as I sum it up, it's time for us to change. It's time for us to take action and take positive action to improve the situation in British business schools. Thank you. So I would suggest that I pass it on immediately to Nick Beach, who is now has the floor.
So thank you very much, Howard. Thanks, Nellering. It's quite humbling, actually, to follow such great presentations. And I have to say, I completely endorse what's gone before. What I'd like to do is just to say a word about some of the conundrums, some of the challenges, and a little bit about how we might then approach this as universities and as business schools. And so I've entitled this Respecting and Valuing Difference, rather than trying to get us all to be a version of the same thing. So we're trying to avoid an imperative towards imitation, towards sameness, or towards homogeneity. So universities very often aspire to being diverse communities, which implies both difference and connection. So if we're interested in community, then it's not about us all becoming the same sort of thing, that we can have CVs that look the same as each other, that we can have single versions of career track and so on. But actually, how do we learn from each other and how do we change as a result of that? And so coming back to one of the things that Nellorine said, which is about not just doing window dressing, it is about both individual responsibility and also what we do collectively. So from my perspective, and I think this links to what both Sue and Howard were saying, it's about culture ultimately. So there's behavior, and we need to be shifting systematically and systemically what we're doing. So in this situation of universities, although we might want to be and aspire to being diverse communities, and certainly the rhetoric says, there are many factors which push us towards actually being pretty much the same, or perhaps a limited amount of variety between us. And so you'll see that across the world, and in the UK in particular. If you look, for example, at marketisation of HE, that has really been increasing over the last 20 years. Actually, around the world, there's 2 or 3 general types of university that operate in particular market segments, and these things are replicated again and again. So when Howard was talking, he talked, for example, about Harvard and an elite system, and most countries have elite universities of one sort or another. In many countries, so in Germany, I think it's particularly interesting for this, but also true in Ireland, technical universities and more vocational universities, another segment where you can see a particular set of standards come to operate. And we also see around the world specialist universities, so whether either single subject or a small group of subjects. And in business, you can see the number of prominent ones around the world, but it's also true in other subject areas. So the reason I think that's a problem is that the external market, where students go, where employers go, where organizations go, and in fact where academics go, starts to become homogenated into being one of 3 choices rather than having genuine diversity. Similarly, if you look at regulation in HE, that pushes us very typically towards being the same rather than being different. League tables operate around the world, and particularly in the UK, in a way that forces us to pay a particular attention to specific ways of measuring. So Nellorine was saying earlier, what gets measured gets paid attention to. That's absolutely true. And sometimes that can be great, but actually it can be quite distracting from the things that are really important if we become subject to particularly league tables and ways of thinking that don't necessarily reflect good quality and underpinning research in the way that Sue and Nellorine's work is trying to do. And lastly, individual careers. And so this plays to the meritocracy point that was raised by Nellorine. And you can see around the world a set of standards that tend to be fairly homogenous. Traditionally, the PhD you've done, the sort of publications that you've got, the research grants that you've got, and so on. And now that's broadening out a little bit, but still there is a fairly hegemonic view of the way that careers work. And that's one of the big sets of challenges for BAM. So what I want to imply by all of that is, although we ought to be really valuing difference, and then how do we connect those bits of difference together, actually, systemically and culturally, there's a lot of things that force us towards same or adopting one of 2 or 3 patterns in universities, in business schools, and in careers. Because when you really look at what goes on, actually, there is not that much difference taken at that high level. Secondly, I think there's a real challenge in the equality initiatives that have been taken over the years. So if we think particularly about Advanced HE, Athena Swan, the Race Equality Charter, and so on, I think there's a a difficulty for us from a research point of view, because from a research point of view, we're also always interested in intersectionality in the way that these things cross over. So in Nellarine's talk about health and Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups in COVID, particularly in the UK, it's probably a number of factors interacting in the way that operates. In terms of Howard's points about the need for scholarships and bursaries, that's a blend of socioeconomic background and race, ethnicity, and other aspects as well. So there's these complexities that become entwined, and now I know that Advanced HE is, of course, moving in that direction. But in the early versions of Athena Swan, for example, of which I was an advocate and have spent a lot of time supporting and working on, one of the challenges there was a view on gender rather than other things. Now, the advantage of that is that you end up doing something, so you do get some action. The disadvantage is that you end up with certain areas with less attention to them. And I think it's really important for us to understand those connectivities. And the last difficulty I want to just raise awareness of is multiple paradigms. And if we look at ethnicity, gender, and other forms of diversity studies, we know that there are different paradigms operating. And so there's a realist paradigm in which we're really concerned with the numbers, the counting, the understanding of the levels at which students, staff have reached in universities. There's also a constructionist paradigm where we might be concerned with, for example, performativity. And if we think about Butler's work on gender as just one example that has challenged the idea of just a simple binary and actually saying that really most of us, most of the time, are performing, we are producing a version of ourselves, including our gender, our ethnicity, our beliefs, and all of those sorts of things, that is genuinely something that is embedded within particular cultures, then it's not as straightforward as saying we just need to change the numbers. We do need to change the numbers, but there's a cultural element to this, or performativity element to this as well. And lastly, a critical realism paradigm would pay particular attention to the fundamental societal conflicts and inequalities that go before and prevent, in that sense of the word prevent, they go before any of the actions that organizations can take. So the reason that I want to raise those things is that actually a lot of the interesting thought and research is quite difficult to connect when it comes from those different paradigms. And I think that is one thing as universities we absolutely have to do. And secondly, that we have to be realistic about, as Nellarine was saying, we've all got individual responsibility. I completely buy into that. But there's also a big collective cultural change that we need to be part of. And so in the next slide, if it's okay, thank you. My question back to myself and to all of us is, how can we play a part in that sort of cultural change? And so firstly, I think that is about understanding the interwoven issues, but then not getting so lost that we don't have the right sort of priorities. So coming back to the work, for example, that Sue has led over the years, one of the big advantages of that is the complete clarity. And I think that came across really well in her presentation and the work that she's done with others. There's a clear issue and there's clear steps and actions that need to be taken. You could see that in Howard's presentation and in Nellarine's. But on top of that, we need to think about connectivity. So there is a lot of, following the Black Lives Matter issues, a lot of fora that are being used in universities, a lot of trying to listen to voice. But what is actually being done as a result of that? How are we actually disturbing some of the taken for granted ways of operating? And so one of my roles at the moment is obviously as VC of Middlesex University. And one thing that we've been trying to do there is more student-led open forum, not just with our university students, but with FE students across London. This relates to one of the things Nellarine was saying, so that we're actually trying to get an agenda set, not by the senior members of the university, but actually by the students, and then try to work through that and have an action plan that comes out of it. But we're at the beginning of that, we're not at the end of that. Secondly, there are structures and there are preventing going before social structures that really set in train a whole set of careers, a whole set of choices about curriculum, a whole set of choices about nature of university. And we need to be able to challenge those. So partly that's about structural change, but we also know the old phrase that culture will eat whatever it wants for breakfast, and structure is one of them. So the old cultures will find ways around structural reform unless we're actually really shifting them. So, for example, what do we do not only about putting people into positions, but changing mindsets, about changing our understanding of how we stand up for particular things? One of the things that we've been looking at recently and taking advice on is different forms of training that are around experiential training. Actually, the sort of thing that we would do in a lot of our educational practice, we ought to be doing ourselves. One thing that I found particularly helpful, Nelorine mentioned the mentoring work that we talked about in the previous research. And reverse mentoring is something that we've found to be really, really important. So in Middlesex, the senior team is, in terms of gender diversity, 50-50, which is great. In terms of ethnic diversity, it's 100% white. And so one of the things that we're doing is having reverse mentors, in which I've got Black and Asian staff and students who then work with me, and they are mentoring me in terms of trying to help me change my thinking, change my action, and decide what we do. And we're doing that with other teams. So again, that's just at the beginning point. And I think there's all sorts of complexity to that. So I saw one of the questions was, should we be using the term BAME or not? And I think I'm an identity scholar, so I find it hugely problematic, and that we do need to pay attention to the different sorts of divisions. Next, in terms of governance and systems, we certainly need to be doing some measuring and understanding what those measures mean, and to measure with the right level of granularity. So the ones that have gone on this slide are just illustrative, and I don't think they are at the right level of granularity. But if we look at, so this is Equality Challenge Unit data, just over 9.4% of staff in higher education institutes in the UK are Black or minority ethnic, and that's the terminology that they're using. For Middlesex, we're above that. We've got 28%, but we're still well over 50% white British. If we look at promoted posts, so this is professors, senior managers, we're 16%, which is better than the national average, but nowhere near, I think, where it needs to be in terms of the monitoring. If we look at students, for the UK, this is Office for Students data, 16% across the UK are Black or minority ethnic. In Middlesex, 63% are Black and Asian minority ethnic in the UK undergraduate population. But again, what we would see that is as a starting point for the conversation and for action, and to try and build culture change. I don't think this is a job that's done. I think, in fact, we still need to get back to some of the points that Howard was raising about how we actually understand the formative actions that can change the way that we operate as a culture. And for me, my final point around that is I come back to this point of how we significantly challenge ourselves. So it's really about how we become different people enacting the culture. And that is about us genuinely being a learning culture, because we have to be open to change ourselves, which is about people in leadership positions of all sorts across universities, including professors, deans, heads of school, and university exec. Actually, it's how do we make ourselves vulnerable? How do we actually open up from positions of strength to say, what's wrong with what I'm doing? What can I change? And that's actually quite a tough thing to do. And that's why I think we need things like reverse mentoring that can help us open up to those questions. Thank you.